Happy Monday, everyone, and welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Eikenberry. If you're with me live, you probably know that. You can see that on the screen. I am so glad that you're here. Today on this episode, we're going to do something different, at least something that's different from what you see most weeks, but it's more like what I've done in the past 2 or 3 years. Before I get into that and exactly what we're going to do on this week's episode for the final, on the actual podcast, which will be the final episode of the year, I want to say, if you're here with us live, I hope you will say hello, tell us where you're from. And if you are an ongoing podcast listener, please tell us that as well. As we go, I'm going to talk about several things, and but I can certainly answer your questions as well. So if there's something that I say or talk about that you'd like me to comment on a little bit more, or you have a specific question you'd like me to answer, I'll do my best to answer those as we go. But I have several goals for this episode, and it really comes down to 3 words. I'm going to do a countdown of the top 5 most downloaded episodes of the year. I'll put a little asterisk on that and say more about that in a second. I'm going to share with you my lessons from each of those 5 as I count them down. And then lastly, I'm going to share with you the actions that I've taken or am taking or will continue to take in relationship to those lessons. So what I'm going to try to do today is model what I encourage people to do each week when I have a guest with me, and that is to take action on what they learn. I'm going to try to model it by talking about what I've learned. And so, I grew up in the age of listening to Casey Kasem and the American countdown, top 40 countdown shows, and the same on the country music side, to listen to what were the top songs of the week each week. And at the end of the year, they would do a countdown. It was a big deal because you didn't have the internet to find out what the top songs of the year were, and so you'd count them down. So what they would do is they would tell a little bit about the artist or a story about the song, and then they would play the song. Well, I'm going to say maybe a little bit about each of these 5 episodes, these 5 folks, but mostly we're going to do less about the countdown and more about using that as an example of who we're going to talk about, what I've learned from each of them. So I am super excited to share this with you. And again, if you've got questions or comments, feel free to ask them. If you've watched those episodes, let me know. And if you haven't, you can certainly always go to wherever you're watching podcasts. So you can always go to remarkablepodcast.com to listen to, watch, in almost every case, these episodes. And I hope that you'll do that as a result of this conversation. So let's start our countdown of the most downloaded and therefore listened or watched episodes of the year from the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Now, this would be through downloads this morning. And because most of these episodes are also released and done live here on various social media channels, we're counting only the downloads from the actual podcast. So, that's the way we're doing the counting. Take it for what it's worth. I can promise you that outside of these 5, in the other 50 episodes or other 45 episodes of the year, there's tremendous content, but I had to pick the line somewhere. So we picked it as 5, and here they are. The 5th most downloaded episode of the year is Mastering Your Thoughts and Emotions with Todd Stottlemyre. If you recognize Todd's name, he's a former Major League Baseball pitcher, won a couple of World Series titles, a very impressive guy, has had a couple of separate careers since baseball, one of which is to write. And so he joined me to talk about his book, The Observer, which the subtitle has the ideas there, Mastering Your Thoughts and Emotions. So The Observer is a modern fable about mastering your thoughts and emotions. And it's like many of the business fables or parable types of books. It's a story with great ideas in it. So obviously, I'm not going to give you a full rundown of everything Todd and I talked about. But so again, I'm going to highlight, again, my lessons and my actions. So there were 3 things that we talked about that I thought were especially important. And the first one is one that I preach all of the time, and that is that everyone should have a coach. Now, Todd comes at this from a past of being in Major League Baseball, grew up with coaches. His dad was a Major League Baseball pitcher as well. So we talked a lot about the importance of having a coach and the value of having a coach. We talked about the idea of pain as a teacher, and we can learn from times of pain and times of challenge and struggle. And I thought that was a really valuable thing. But the thing that we talked about, and he used it by telling a story from his father when he was a pitcher, that led to the point that he said that life all can come down to 3 to 5 things. And if you master those 3 to 5 things, good things will happen for you. And so that's the lesson that I've really been spending time thinking about since he and I had the conversation and since it was released on the podcast. And that's the idea of what are the 3 to 5 things that I'm going to focus on. There was a book that came out several years ago by several authors, including John Gordon. You might know John, that talks about having one word as your focus for the year. And I've done that some years in the past, and I've challenged my team to do that again this year. And we will select a word for our organization. So the big idea, the action that I'm taking from my conversation with Todd is all about focusing on the most important critical things. His idea was very specifically that it all comes down to those 3 to 5 things. If you get those 3 to 5 things right, good things will happen for you. So there is number 5. Number 4, it comes from a guy that you probably have never heard of, but trust me, if you haven't watched our conversation or listened to our conversation, you're going to want to do that. His name is Carlos Valdes-Dapena, and he is an expert on collaboration specifically. Excuse me. He worked at IBM. He worked at the Mars Corporation for 17 years, thinking about working on helping the organization around collaboration. And one of his books is called Lessons from Mars. Get it? Lessons from Mars. Subtitle is How One Global Company Cracked the Code on High Performance Collaboration and Teamwork. And again, he and I talked about a number of things that I think extend beyond what most people tend to think about team building. He and I have a lot of similar ideas in that we both feel like a lot of the traditional approaches to team building, the ways that we think about it, are outmoded, helpful, but not successful enough. And we need to figure out how we can truly make collaboration happen in organizations. And so that was really where we spent the time in the conversation. And so one of the big ideas is that conventional team building doesn't always really work or get us the results that we were hoping for when we talked about it. The second thing that we talked a lot about is that a lot of times we work hard to hire high achievers. And if you have people who are high achievers, they're really good at getting things accomplished. They have confidence, they are productive, and oftentimes, while they will understand the value of collaboration, they don't necessarily want to collaborate themselves. Like, that's a fine thing, but like, just let me go do my stuff. So we talked a lot about the idea of making collaboration work for people with a high achievement mentality, which means we have to help them see the value in it for them. And I think the biggest idea that I took from our conversation that I've been applying with our team is, and it's interesting because sometimes, as the host of this show, I get the chance to hear things. Sometimes I hear things from people that are very similar to things that I say to others, but that maybe I'm not always doing very well. And that's the case with the action that I took from the conversation that Carlos and I had, which is the idea that sometimes we have to decide when collaboration isn't needed. So I've spent a lot of time helping organizations since then think about that, because all of the challenges that people are having with, we got to get people back in the office so we can collaborate again. Collaboration doesn't really work when we're not together. And so the question becomes, when do we really need to? What does that really need to look like? And so part of that solution is to recognize when we don't actually need to collaborate. So one of the actions that I've taken is to ask myself that question, ask my clients that question as well. So decide, one of the ways to have better collaboration is to decide when we don't need to have it. There's a lesson from number 4. The third most downloaded podcast from the Remarkable Leadership Podcast in 2022 through this morning, through the 13th of December, came from David Bradford and Carole, and we talked about building exceptional relationships. And this conversation was based in part on their book, Connect, Building Exceptional Relationships with Family, Friends, and Colleagues. And it comes from their work with a very famous course at Stanford that's for the Stanford Business School. And it's one of the most recognized and talked about courses at Stanford for many, 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 many years. And so they've taken some of that course called Interpersonal Dynamics and put it into this book. So we had a conversation about relationships, and we talked about exceptional relationships, and the piece about exceptional relationships that I think is worth adding on to whatever you might think that great relationships have, like honesty as an example, and the ability to deal with conflict. But it's also the fact that in exceptional relationships, both parties care about the other person's growth. And I think if you think about that in terms of family, friends, and colleagues, that's a really awesome way to think about it. And some of you may say, well, I wouldn't say that everyone in my family, could I say that about, that we mutually care about the other person's growth. And that might be where some of the rub comes in terms of the relationship not being exactly what you'd like it to be. And certainly when we think about at work with our colleagues, then if we can create that into our relationships, I think that's of great value. It's one of the things we talked about. We talked about leaders bringing themselves and being themselves. That's, I think, a theme throughout many of the episodes this year, where the ideas of transparency and vulnerability as a leader shows up a lot in conversations these days. But the useful thing about our conversation, the conversation I had with Carole and David, is that we talked about this in the concept of the risk that it puts in front of us to do that. And that oftentimes the reason that leaders don't want to share more of themselves as appropriate is that they're afraid people won't respect them as a result, when in reality, they'll likely respect you more. So I thought that was a very useful thing that we talked about. But I think the thing that I took from it that I've been using is the conversation that we had about defensiveness. And admittedly, it was one of the things I brought up from the book for our conversation. And here's the thought. The thought is that and David really said this. He said, Kevin, if we are defensive and we don't want to be, it doesn't help us to say, well, I'm going to stop being defensive, because it's a natural reaction. The feeling of someone telling me something and then feeling defensive about it, wanting to make a comment about it, is natural. His point was that we can choose whether or not we're going to display it. We can choose whether or not we're going to talk about it. We can choose that part. And rather than trying to tamp down the natural inclination to be defensive, to be more intentional about whether we choose to say anything about it, or just sort of live with it, hold on to it, and let ourselves get past it. Because the longer that we're in this defensive mode, we've got no chance of taking anything in. We really want to get past that. And so I love the fact that we talked about not being guilty about being defensive, but to work on holding on to it and making a conscious choice about whether we're going to display it, whether we're going to do anything about it, whether we're going to say anything about it. And I have found that in making that conscious choice, it's helping me learn more from what I might otherwise have tried to excuse away. And so I think that that's a really valuable sort of thought. It was one of the most valuable things that I got from it. And when I started this podcast, so let me just bring up number 2. So the second most downloaded episode of the year was with Bill Novelli, and we talked about helping leaders change the world for the better. It's a pretty good topic, pretty understandable that a title like that might get a lot of downloads, because a lot of people are subscribers, of course, but then episodes get a lot more because of the topic, because of the title. I think that title helped. And we talked about Bill's book, Good Business, with the subtitle of The Talk, Fight, Win Way to Change the World. And we did talk about his talk, fight, win way, but that's not what I want to talk about here. Actually, before I tell you more about what I learned from Bill, let me tell you that when I started the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, I said our goal is twofold in terms of the guests. I want to have leadership experts, which oftentimes means people that have written a book about, spent a lot of time thinking about leadership and related topics. But I also want to have expert leaders, people that have been in the trenches, done it, led organizations, led at the highest levels, led with great success. And Bill is one of those wonderful people that we get every once in a while that's both. He led AARP, he led many other organizations, and then he has become a coach, a consultant, and worked with many other organizations, has written a book. So he is in both of those spots. So we talked about a number of things, some of the things from his book, and some questions I wanted to ask him about his experience as a leader and walking in his shoes. And so one of the things that we talked about a lot from the book, and again, common topic, talked about in really valuable ways, and that was the importance of finding purpose. We talked about finding purpose for self first. Now, I don't know if I did tick marks for the year about how many episodes does that topic come up. I'm going to guess at least half, which should be a reminder to us about how important it is. And yet I find that oftentimes the purpose thing is one of the things that people all nod their head at, say we need to do, and that don't really get at it. And so I think the conversation that Bill and I had, especially in the early part of the podcast, was very helpful in terms of thinking about that. But we really talked a lot about building teams. And even though he led at the highest levels in a CEO slot, we talked a lot about the fact that it's the teams that make the decisions. He made a point of saying that, when he was leading AARP, he said there are probably 100 decisions that get made. I think he said every week. There's 100 decisions get made here every week. I'm making 5 of them. So I need to have the right people. I need to be empowering those people because it's all of the decisions that are driving the organization forward. He said, I'm not making them all. And I would say to you, if you think you need to make them all, you're making a mistake. And so we had a really interesting conversation about the importance of teams. And he talked a lot about, or we had this conversation. In fact, it's the quote that we pulled from his episode about mediocrity, that we got to be careful about mediocrity, that it is a, let me see if I can get the note that I wrote down here. That it is a chronic disease. That mediocrity is a chronic disease. Now, I'm not going to say that that's the big lesson that I took in terms of action, because I certainly don't, because he talked about the fact that, it's one thing to think about recruiting and hiring people to join your team, but sometimes you have to move people out. You have to get rid of people because they're not helping the team and they become a chronic disease, or mediocrity is the chronic disease. So I'm not going to say, well, I paired some people out of my team. I didn't do that this year by any means, but I think that I definitely spent some time thinking about where is the mediocrity in terms of the work that we're doing, the work that I'm doing and what I'm delivering. Use that as a jumping off point to hopefully raise my game a bit. So there's sort of the now what for Kevin. Before we get to the final one, I want to make another observation. If you are an ongoing listener or have listened even only once or twice during the course of the year to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, and I'll put up that link. You can go to remarkablepodcast.com to listen to any of these or any others of the nearly 300 episodes that I've had with guests over the years. One of the things I do in every single episode is ask this question near the very end. I ask the question not of the guest, but of you, the listener or viewer. And I ask the question, now what? What are you going to do as a result of what you've learned? And so what I've been trying to do is model that for each of them. Here's some things I learned, and here's what I'm doing with that learning. And so to me, that's the greatest value that we can provide you, we being I and our guests and my team, in providing these great guests and great ideas for you, is to urge you to take action. So let me get to the number one most downloaded episode of the year. And I know our producer Lisa will be happy to know that this is the number one, because I believe it was one of her favorites. And it certainly is one of my favorites as well. It's about a very, very important topic. It happens to be about a topic that we all happen to know a little bit about. And the topic is listening. And the episode is connecting with others through listening. Here's the book, Listen Like You Mean It, Connecting with Others Through Listening, with Ximena Vengoechea. And so she and I had a fabulous conversation about listening. And it's one of those topics that we all know something about. We all do it every day. We all know it's important. And yet we all would say we could do it better. And Ximena has a tremendous presence about her, and the way we came at this, I thought was very, very helpful. And here are the ideas that I took from her. She said that to be a better listener, to be what she would call an empathetic listener and not just a surface listener. I love that idea of surface listening, which is what we all do most of the time. We do at default. How do we get from surface listening, being polite, to something more deeply? And she says we want to be on the journey toward empathetic listening. She said it requires three things of us. And those three things are to be humble. We talked about humility and staying out of judgment, because clearly if we move into judgment, we're no longer listening. We're just waiting for our chance to rebut or comment. We talked about curiosity. And one of the things that I think makes her book so good is that she comes at her work, comes at listening from her work as a researcher around usability. So the thought of connecting research and listening to others and tying that to listening, I thought was really useful, which gets us at this idea of curiosity, which I'm going to come back to in a second. And then, so three pieces: humility, curiosity, and lastly, empathy. And, empathy has been a big part of things that I've written about over the last 15, 18 months in relationship to the pandemic and COVID, is the idea that we as leaders must be more empathetic than ever, that it's becoming more and more expected of us, that team members want us, need us, nearly demand us to be more empathetic, or they may vote with their feet to go somewhere else. And so I really resonated with that. But the thing that I've taken and been using since Ximena and I's conversation is the idea of curiosity. Curiosity as a way to be a better listener. And the insight that I've come to is this: that without question, when we are more curious, we're more willing to listen, because we're in a information acquisition mode, which is what we ought to be in as a listener, to understand it at a deeper level. When I go back to college, and you can go back to any of your schooling, and you think about the classes that you found most interesting were the ones you probably did the best in, and you probably paid the most attention in the lectures, right? Well, there's something connected there. Like when we can find a reason to be curious, when we can find a reason to be interested, then suddenly we listen better. And there are exercises that I've long used in workshops that get at that point indirectly. And so I have taken as my now what from my conversation with Ximena, the idea of consciously working on being more curious, especially when I notice that I'm being a surface listener, right? Like we all know that moment when we're like, yeah. We're listening, we're nodding, we're doing some of the physical things, but we're not really there. Is when I am present enough and self-aware enough to realize that's what I'm doing, then the word that goes through my mind now is be curious. What can you be curious about here? What are you missing here? What can you learn here? And when I've done that, I have found myself moving into being a better listener. So maybe that's useful to you. So there are the top 5 most downloaded episodes of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast from January until today, basically, which is the 13th of December. Now, as I think about these 5 episodes, I thought it was useful to share my overall insight about them. We do episodes, of course, about things like strategy, and we do episodes about things like customer service and innovation and all manner of important leadership topics. But look at the arc of these episodes: listening, our emotions, our relationships, and even our collaboration. And notice that the things that resonated the most, that got the most people to raise their hand and perk up their ears, were topics that were about us being better. And, I have long said, and I've often written, that as we become a better human, we become a better leader. And so I'm actually very excited, not because I don't think we had some tremendous episodes this year about culture and a variety of other really important leadership topics, but that in a year when we maybe as a society have been a little bit more reflective, we've reflected two topics that were about things completely in our control, which is what do we need to do to get better, to build relationships, to understand and master our emotions a little bit more, to understand collaboration a little bit more, because we play a part in that. And then in the number one slot, to be a listener. I did a little more playing around with the data. And so before I wrap up, I want to share something else with you. So if you don't know, at least as of now, the Remarkable Leadership Podcast does two things. Once a week, we release an episode where I have a guest. And once a week, we reuse one of our Remarkable TV episodes, which are recorded in our studio downstairs and are initially created for YouTube and my blog. And so each week, if you subscribe to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, you will get all the guest interviews, and you'll find all of those at remarkablepodcast.com. But you will also get all of the once a week, you'll get a Remarkable TV episode, which is just Kevin, and it's short. It's like 5 minutes long. So I also looked to see which of those were most downloaded. And one of the 5 was very much about our relationships and our communication with each other, which was called moving from transaction to interaction in our communication. Another one of the top 5 was about remembering to use our phone to actually talk to people and not just to text people and for other purposes, to remind ourselves that this mobile device is also a phone, that the most underutilized tool in our technological arsenal right now might be our phone as an actual phone. So again, 2 of the top 5 of those were in this same vein, very much about personal, professional development as leaders, as humans. So there is our end of the year episode for the podcast. There is our live for today, a chance for you to understand the top 5 and get a sense and maybe get excited to go listen to the top 5 episodes of the year or to learn more about those books. If you're listening to this on the podcast, we'll have the links to all of that in the show notes. And you can go find any of those episodes right there at remarkablepodcast.com as well. It was a pleasure to be with you today, whether you're listening to me live or listening to me later. And it is a pleasure and an honor if you're continuing to be a listener to and an action taker from the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Have a happy new year. And we'll talk to you next week.